Hey everybody, so we're going to pick back up with our Transcontinental Railroad study. So make sure that you get out your social studies journal. You can press pause and get that out if you need to. But we're going to pick right back off where we left, which is talking about the Golden Spike and how the two railroad companies were meeting together at that one place called the Promontory Point, Utah. And that is where we see that Golden Spike has been placed there. So it's a pretty cool event that did occur. And we know that we talked about that Golden Spike is now on display in the Stanford Museum of Art in California, which is really cool. So, right now, what I want you to write down is this piece now about how a trip all the way to out west could be made in a week for less than $100. So, beforehand, we were talking about how they had to utilize the Pony Express and transferring that information from one horse to the next. And those men, those orphaned young boys, were hired to do that. So, what I want you to write down right now is to make sure you put down that now, with the Transcontinental Railroad being completed, people could make the trip in a week for less than $100. So make sure you press pause if you need to take down that note. So now let's talk about some railroad concerns. So there definitely were some railroad concerns, especially when it was being built. So Native Americans were greatly affected by the railroad because it was being built across their land. So pause and make sure that you write down something about. You can summarize just the brief overview that Native Americans were affected because they were building over their land. Another major railroad concern was that because Native Americans were living on that land, and buffalo were actually the main food source, meat source for Native Americans, the workers were scaring away or eating or just simply shooting the buffalo for fun. So it was killing the food source or scaring away the food source of the Native Americans. So we just put down that one, the railroad was being built across their land, but now also the workers are eating, scaring away, or simply shooting the buffalo for fun. So make sure you write down this specific note that this is now the second railroad concern. Our first one was that it was being built across their land, and now the second is that their food source is being taken away. Now, the third railroad concern that we're going to write down is that there were even many attacks on railroad workers by the Native Americans, mainly because the Native Americans were trying to protect their land and their way of life with the buffalo. So, these men, these companies that were hired by the government to, they were given the land to build the railroad on, but they were building on Native Americans' land that had already been pretty much deemed theirs. So that was definitely a major third concern, is that workers were being attacked by these Native Americans who were trying to protect their land. So we have one railroad concern is that we're building on Native Americans' land. The second is that the workers were scaring or shooting away their buffalo, their food source. And then thirdly, the workers were being attacked by Native Americans. So, as we move on, make sure you have written down those three concerns of the railroad. You can pause and make sure you have that written down. Now we're going to move into talking about the specifics between each company. So, the Union Pacific Railroad Company, and this is actually a real photo of a worker, they had a really huge problem finding workers. But after the Civil War, thousands of Irish immigrants moved to work on the railroad. So the word had spread globally that there was a railroad being built and that there were job opportunities. So there were Irish people that were bringing their families over, and they were immigrating to the United States to come work on the railroads. Some of the workers also included former Confederate soldiers and even African Americans. So that's that portion that's after the Civil War. Once slaves have been freed, and African Americans are seen as fully human and fully a person as they are now given the opportunity to work on the railroad. So they were wanting to, provide for themselves and make money and make a living. So they were also a part of the workforce for the Union Pacific Railroad. So make sure you take a second to pause and to write down the fact that the Union Pacific, UP, had a problem finding workers. Make sure you have down that the three types of people that were working for the Union Pacific was the Irish immigrants, Confederate soldiers, and African Americans. All right, once you're ready, you can go ahead and take a look at these photos. You might want to pause and check in and see what you see, how they're dressed, their location, what setting they're in. Observe these photos and see what you can see. Now let's talk about the Central Pacific Railroad. So the Central Pacific Railroad had a lot more difficult task when they were building the railroad. Remember we talked about the Union Pacific was building through Nebraska, which was that flat land area through here, right? But if you look, this is showing you kind of the mountain ranges, the Sierra Nevada mountain range that the Central Pacific was having to work through. You can only imagine having to create a flat space within a mountain range so that the train can run smoothly is going to be extremely challenging. So make sure you have written down that the Central Pacific had a more difficult task and that they had to build through the Sierra Nevada mountain range. That is why they had the disadvantage. So this right here circled is that Sierra Nevada mountain range, which was the biggest, largest task that they had to work through. This is another great visual of the Sierra Nevada mountains. You can only imagine of, how these people had to figure out how to get a train through a mountainscape. So let's talk about that as well. The work was very difficult for the Central Pacific because mainly as well, they were also having trouble finding workers. So, as much as they had the job opportunities available, they were having troubles just like the Union Pacific on finding people to actually do the job. So, make sure you sneak that into your notes that the CP had a hard time finding workers too. So, a man named Charles Crocker, one of the leaders of the CP, the Central Pacific Railroad, suggested that this company would hire Chinese workers. Okay, so the Union Pacific was hiring three other people. Remember, they were the Irish immigrants, ex Confederate soldiers, and African Americans. The Central Pacific really tapped into hiring Chinese workers. Okay, so put that in there that the CP hired Chinese workers. Many of these Chinese immigrants were coming to California during the gold rush. Remember, we said that when people were moving out west into this area where my mouse is, people were just raving about how they were running into gold, making so much money, and just a good old life. And so people globally were hearing about that. And they were saying, like, hey, like, we want to go over there too. So this is kind of what sparked Chinese immigrants to coming to California. Okay. So they would kind of leave China in this area. They would come around the Pacific Ocean over here, all the way wrapped back. If we think about this globe, this is a flat map, a 2D map, but our globe is round. So they would come around the Pacific Ocean on all the way over here onto the West Coast. So they were not only just trying to come for the gold rush and the good life that it was offering, but they were also trying to escape a few things like war, poverty, and even famine. So take a moment to take a few notes here. The Chinese immigrants were coming to the U.S. to escape war, poverty, and famine. The biggest thing here of the downfall is that when these Chinese immigrants were working, they were highly discriminated against. And Americans did not believe that they could endure such hard work out there on the Transcontinental Railroad. A lot of people were upset that these Chinese immigrants and even the Irish immigrants for the Union Pacific were taking up the jobs, which People were upset because, they were wanting to make a life too. But these Chinese immigrants were being highly discriminated against because they just felt like the Americans were feeling like they could not endure this work. So the Chinese immigrants essentially, guys, proved to be the hardest workers the company had ever seen. These Chinese immigrants came over and worked and helped the Central Pacific make their way through the Sierra Nevada mountain range, those hard, rocky terrain. They were able to really, really, really be a great asset to the team and help the Central Pacific Railroad push through that hard time of getting through that mountain range. Make sure you put in your notes that the Chinese immigrants were proved to be the hardest workers. This is another great picture of them. Some of the hard workers that were mentioned earlier. So then, here's the cool part. Eventually, Chinese immigrants made up 80% of that Central Pacific workforce for the company. 80%. That is over half of the workers were Chinese immigrants because they were such hard workers and actually were able to get the job done of blasting through the tunnels, creating tunnels, working their way through the mountain ranges and that solid rock, and they were really training and teaching the American workers how to be successful in that. So, one key thing to put down is that Chinese immigrants made up 80% of their team, and then that they were able to help with the difficult task. Here's another great visual picture. You can see that these people have blasted through the rock, creating that tunnel of where the railroad would sneak through to try to get to the other side. That was definitely a difficult task to do. Even here, you see that the workers continued their labor all the way through the mountains, parts of the desert, and even deadly snowstorms. They did not stop working. Okay, they were working through all different types of weather year round. So, just to kind of finish out here, the Central Pacific finished building through that mountain range in 1867. And they sped up as they neared the end because, one, they were more skilled at this point. They knew what needed to be done. And they were then kind of entering into that more flatland area as they got to Utah. So, make sure you put in here that they were able to finish in 1867 and they were able to speed up their process towards the end. So that's going to make us finish here at our study with Transcontinental Railroad. We will talk a little bit more later as we continue down our study, but these are the most important parts of the Central Pacific Railroad, the Union Pacific, and the Transcontinental Railroad in and of itself. So make sure that you take some time to reflect, pause, and go back if you need to take any further notes. We will be having a quiz here soon, so make sure you're studying and being familiar with what we're learning. See you next time.